In 1967, on a hill in Vietnam, United States Marines were found dead with their rifles taken apart beside them. Not damaged, not lost, disassembled. Cleaning rods jammed down the barrels. They had died in the middle of a firefight, trying to fix a weapon that had stopped working. The rifle was the M16. On paper, it was the most advanced infantry weapon on Earth. Lighter than anything the enemy carried. More accurate. Faster to reload. And the reason it failed had nothing to do with the man who designed it. It failed because the United States Army changed it. Not by accident. Not through incompetence. Through a series of deliberate decisions made by men in offices who had been told to adopt a rifle they had not designed, did not want, and could not forgive. Congress investigated. The report used language that congressional reports do not use. This is how it happened. In 1956, the United States Army holds trials for a new service rifle. Springfield Armory responds. It was founded in 1794 by George Washington. It has designed or produced every standard American service rifle for 160 years. The Springfield rifle, the M1903. The M1 Garand, the rifle General Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised. There is no institution in American arms manufacturing with deeper authority. It is the arsenal of the Republic. Winchester responds. Founded 1866. The rifle that won the West. Fabrique Nationale of Belgium responds with the FAL, a rifle that will be adopted by more than 90 countries. And a small division of an aircraft company enters a rifle made of aluminium and plastic. The division is called Armalite. It is part of Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation. It occupies a shop in Hollywood, California, and you can count its engineering staff on two hands. It has never produced a service rifle. It has never produced any rifle in quantity. It makes aircraft components. Its chief engineer is a 34-year-old named Eugene Stoner. He has no engineering degree. He has no college degree of any kind. He spent the Second World War as a Marine aviation ordnance man in the South Pacific and northern China, bolting guns onto aircraft. Before that, he installed armament at an aircraft plant in California. He is not an arms designer. He is an aircraft man who happens to be obsessed with rifles. Springfield Armory did not take him seriously, and here is where this story diverges from every other story of this kind. Springfield won. Stoner lost. Eugene Morrison Stoner was born on the 22nd of November, 1922, in Gosport, Indiana, and raised in Long Beach, California. He finished high school. That is the entirety of his formal education. He went to work at Vega Aircraft, installing armament on aeroplanes. Then the war came, and he joined the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps put him in aviation ordnance. And for 4 years, Eugene Stoner's job was to understand exactly how automatic weapons work when they are bolted to something that flies. This matters more than any degree he could have earned, and here is why. Aircraft engineering in the 1940s was the most aggressive materials science on the planet. Every gram mattered. Aluminium alloys, early plastics, stressed skin construction. Aircraft engineers spent their careers asking one question over and over: how do we make this lighter without making it weaker? Firearms engineering asked a different question. Firearms engineering asked, how do we make this the way we have always made this, but slightly better? Rifles were made of walnut and steel. That was not a decision. It was a premise. It had been the premise since the flintlock. A service rifle weighed 9 or 10 pounds because a service rifle weighed 9 or 10 pounds. Eugene Stoner did not inherit that premise because he had never been taught it. He came out of the Marines, worked as a machinist, and started designing rifles in his garage in his spare time, not as a business, as a compulsion. In 1954, a man named George Sullivan founded Armalite as a small division of Fairchild, with an explicit mission that sounded, to the American arms establishment, faintly ridiculous: build firearms using aerospace materials and aerospace methods. They hired the garage inventor as chief engineer. The AR-10 is the rifle that should have ended the story before it started. It fires the full-power 7.62 NATO cartridge, the same round as every serious battle rifle of the era, and it weighs a fraction over 7 pounds. The M14, Springfield's entry, weighs more than 9. The FN Fayal weighs nearly 10. Stoner got there by treating a rifle like an airframe. The receiver is aluminium, not machined steel. The furniture is plastic, not walnut. And the gas system does not use a piston at all. Every self-loading rifle of the period tapped gas from the barrel and used it to drive a metal rod, which drove the bolt. A piston, a moving part. Weight, complexity, reciprocating mass. Stoner deleted it. He ran the gas down a thin tube directly into the bolt carrier and let the gas itself do the work. Direct impingement. No rod, no piston. Fewer parts, less weight, less mass moving around to disturb the aim. Aircraft engineers had been routing high-pressure gas through tubes for 20 years. It was not exotic. It was Tuesday. To the American arms establishment, it was heresy, and the objection was not really engineering. The objection was that a rifle made of aluminium and plastic was not a rifle. It was a toy. Soldiers would not respect it. It looked wrong. The trials at Springfield Armory in 1956 were not a fair fight, and everyone involved understood that. Springfield Armory was running the trials. Springfield Armory was also competing in the trials with the T-44, a rifle that was, in substance, an M1 Garand with a detachable magazine. The arsenal that would choose the winner had entered its own horse. The AR-10 arrived late, which cost it. And during torture testing, a barrel burst. A composite steel and aluminum barrel that Armalite had fitted in pursuit of yet more weight saving. Stoner had argued against it. It failed. That failure became the entire story of the AR-10 in the official record. Springfield's T-44 was adopted as the M14 in 1957. The establishment had defended its territory. The aircraft company with the plastic rifle went home. And that should have been the end of Eugene Stoner. What saved him was not the Army. The Army was finished with him. It was a general named Willard Wyman who asked a question nobody at Springfield wanted asked. What if the cartridge is wrong? The 7.62 NATO round is powerful, accurate, and effective past 600 meters. And the studies coming out of the Second World War and Korea said the same thing the Germans had found in 1943. Infantry almost never shoot at anything past 300 meters. Most firefights happen inside 200. The full-power cartridge was solving a problem that did not exist and charging soldiers for it in weight, recoil, and ammunition they could not carry enough of. Wyman asked Armalite for a small calibre, high-velocity rifle. 222 varmint cartridge, 223 thousandths of an inch. A bullet the size of a pencil lead, moving at over 3,000 feet per second. The rifle weighed 6.5 pounds. A soldier could carry 3 times the ammunition for the same weight. Recoil was so light that a small man could hold full automatic on target. He called it the AR-15. The Army Ordnance Corps rejected it, then rejected it again. Then commissioned tests that critics inside the Pentagon would later argue were structured to produce failures, using ammunition and conditions chosen for the purpose. Springfield Armory had just spent a decade and an enormous amount of money putting the M14 into production. The M14 was the arsenal's own design, the descendant of the Garand, the continuation of 160 years of institutional identity. Admitting the AR-15 was better did not mean admitting a rifle was better. It meant admitting the arsenal was obsolete, so the AR-15 did not enter American service through the Army. It entered through a party. In July 1960, General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, the man who firebombed Tokyo, attended a 4th of July gathering at a private shooting range in Maryland. Someone had brought AR-15s and a row of watermelons. LeMay shot the watermelons. He asked what the rifle was. He was told. He went back to the Pentagon and ordered 8,500 of them for Air Force security police, because the Air Force did not answer to Army ordnance and did not care what Springfield thought. That is how the most widely produced rifle in American history entered the United States military. A general shot fruit at a barbecue. Then Vietnam. In 1962, the AR-15 went into limited testing with South Vietnamese units under Project Agile. The reports that came back were not measured. They described a weapon that was devastating in close jungle combat, that small-statured Vietnamese soldiers could actually control, and that produced wounds so severe the reports were classified. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, was simultaneously discovering that M14 production was a fiasco. Behind schedule, over budget, and in his assessment inferior to the AK-47 the other side was carrying. In 1963, he canceled M14 production. In 1964, he ordered the AR-15 into service as the M16. Understand what has just happened, because everything that follows comes from it. The United States Army Ordnance Corps has been ordered by a civilian to adopt a rifle it did not design, repeatedly rejected, and publicly derided, replacing a rifle it had spent a decade and a fortune developing, produced by an aircraft company in California, and designed by a man with no engineering degree. And now that same ordnance establishment is handed complete control over how that rifle is manufactured, specified, and issued. They made 3 changes. The first was the powder. Stoner designed the AR-15 around IMR propellant, an extruded stick powder. The rifle's gas system, its cyclic rate, its entire timing was built around how that powder burns. Army Ordnance switched to ball propellant. WC-846. The reasons given were supply and cost. Ball powder was made in vast quantity by Olin Mathieson. It was available. It was cheap. It also burned dirtier, far dirtier, leaving a calcium carbonate residue, and it raised the rifle's cyclic rate from around 750 rounds a minute to over 850. A rifle running faster than it was designed to run, while depositing more fouling than it was designed to tolerate, in a mechanism that routes propellant gas directly into the bolt carrier. Stoner objected. He was not asked. The second change was the chamber. Stoner recommended chrome lining the chamber and bore. Chrome resists corrosion. Vietnam is one of the most humid environments on Earth. Army Ordnance declined. Cost. An unlined steel chamber in Southeast Asian humidity pits and corrodes within days. A pitted chamber grips the brass case when it expands on firing. When the extractor pulls, it tears the rim off the cartridge, or rips the case in half, and leaves the front section welded into the chamber. To clear it, you need a cleaning rod. You push it down the muzzle and hammer the stuck case out from the front. Which brings us to the third change. The Army told the troops the M16 did not need cleaning. It was described as self-cleaning. That phrase was put in front of soldiers. Early on, cleaning kits were not issued with the rifles. There was no cleaning rod in the kit because there was no kit. Assemble those 3 decisions and look at what you have built. A rifle running faster than designed, fouling faster than designed, with a chamber that corrodes in the climate it is deployed to, issued to men who have been told it does not require maintenance and given nothing to maintain it with. The result was not a malfunction rate. It was a category of death. A Marine in contact pulls the trigger and nothing happens. The case has torn. He has a rifle with a chunk of brass welded into the chamber and no rod to clear it. His options are a rifle that will never fire again and a bayonet. The letters started reaching home in 1967. Marines wrote to their parents and their congressmen describing men dying beside jammed rifles. Descriptions of finding the dead with their weapons stripped down, cleaning rods rammed down barrels, killed while performing field maintenance in the middle of an assault. One Marine's letter, quoted into the congressional record, described almost every man in his unit having his rifle jam. Parents sent those letters to Congress. In May 1967, Congressman Richard Ickard opened a subcommittee investigation. What the Ickard subcommittee found is on the public record, and it is worse than the rumor. They established that the powder change was made over the objection of the design, that the cyclic rate increase was known, that the chrome chamber had been recommended and refused, and that the Army had propagated the idea that the rifle did not need cleaning while failing to supply the means to clean it. The subcommittee's language was not the language of bureaucratic disappointment. They described the Army's conduct as bordering on criminal negligence and said plainly that responsibility for the failure lay with the Army, not with the rifle, not with Eugene Stoner. With the institution that had rejected him, been overruled, and then been handed his design. The fixes took a year. Chrome-lined chamber and bore. A heavier buffer to slow the cycle. A forward assist the Army demanded and Stoner thought was pointless. Powder specifications tightened. Cleaning kits. Actual cleaning kits with actual rods. Issued to every rifleman, along with a comic book-style manual that told soldiers, in cartoons, that the rifle they had been told was self-cleaning would kill them if they did not clean it. The rifle became the M16A1, and it worked. It worked so well that the M16 family became the longest-serving standard service rifle in the history of the United States. More than 60 years. Still in service. Adopted by dozens of countries. The AR-15 pattern is the most produced rifle in American history and one of the most produced firearms on Earth. Every one of those rifles is the design Springfield Armory rejected, produced by an aircraft company, drawn by a Marine armourer with a high school education. Springfield Armory closed in 1968. The arsenal George Washington founded, that armed the Republic for 174 years, shut its doors 1 year after the Ickert hearings. Now, the part that almost nobody knows. In 1990, a Soviet delegation came to the United States, and Eugene Stoner met Mikhail Kalashnikov. The two men who armed both sides of the Cold War were in a room together. They liked each other immediately. They went shooting. They fired each other's rifles. There is footage. Two elderly men, one American, one Russian, passing weapons back and forth, laughing, entirely at ease, in the country each had spent his life arming against the other. They were the same man in two systems, both outsiders, both mocked by an establishment, both proved right by the only jury that matters, which is a soldier under fire. And in the course of those meetings, Eugene Stoner learned something that reportedly stayed with him. Kalashnikov had never been paid. Over 100 million rifles. Nothing. A pension and an apartment. Stoner had a royalty agreement. Fairchild sold the AR-15 to Colt in 1959 for $75,000 and a percentage, and Stoner's arrangement paid him on rifles produced. Tens of millions of rifles were produced. Eugene Stoner became a wealthy man. He founded further companies. He kept designing until he died. He flew his own aeroplane. Mikhail Kalashnikov, the same year, was living on a state pension in Izhevsk. Two designs. Comparable production. One man rich, one man not. And the difference was not talent, effort, or merit. The difference was which flag was over the building when they signed the paperwork. Eugene Stoner died on the 24th of April, 1997, in Palm City, Florida. He was 74. Kalashnikov outlived him by 16 years and spent part of that time writing to a priest asking whether he was guilty of murder. Stoner was never asked that question, and by every account, never asked it of himself. There is a reason, and it is the whole point of this story. The AK-47 never betrayed anybody. It was designed by a soldier for soldiers, and the state that owned it paid its designer nothing, and it worked exactly as intended in every ditch on Earth for 75 years. The M16 was designed by a Marine for Marines, and the institution that adopted it took his design, changed the powder against his advice, refused the chrome he asked for, told the troops it cleaned itself, sent it into the jungle without cleaning rods, and Americans died holding it with the rifle in pieces in their hands. The rifle did not fail those men. The bureaucracy that could not forgive being beaten by an outsider failed those men, and it did it while holding his drawings. Springfield Armory had 174 years of institutional knowledge. It knew exactly what a rifle was. It knew what a rifle weighed, what a rifle was made of, and who was qualified to design one. Eugene Stoner knew none of that. He knew aircraft. He knew that a thing can be made lighter, and that the way it has always been done is not evidence, and that gas in a tube will do work. He built the rifle America still carries, 60 years later, and the arsenal that laughed at him is a museum.